So really what I'm going to speak about, as people know, I'm a reparationist, so I'm really going to be talking about the links between Pan-Africanism and reparations. And my talk is entitled The Reparatory Justice Re-Engagement with Pan-Africanism, because over these past 3 days we have been discussing the need and importance of re-engaging with Pan-Africanism. So my comments are really based on a chapter that I have produced for a book that's not yet published, and so it's based on, it's not quite the same that's in the book. And it's a forthcoming book that is going to be edited by Professor Hakim Adi on new perspectives in Black British history, as the book title is called. Now, Professor Hakim Adi, I know there's been discussion, interesting discussions about his various books over the last couple of days, but he happens to be my PhD supervisor. And the PhD that I am completing is in history, and it is on the history of the UK contingent of the International Social Movement for African Reparations here in the UK. So in the chapter, I really try and make the links between reparations and Pan-Africanism, which I believe is not strongly made by many Pan-Africanists today. So one of my central arguments and observations is that the core objectives of Pan-Africanism are the attainment and securing of holistic reparatory justice. Now, I'm going to be breaking some things down, and some of you who have heard me speak before, you will have heard some of these things, but I know not everyone has, so please bear with me. And that partly of also that question of Pan-African liberation and nation building are integral to both Pan-Africanism and the struggle to secure and affect, or affect and secure, the right way around, holistic reparatory justice, okay? In effect, the attainment of holistic and multifaceted reparatory justice as the goal has been fundamental to what is known about the Pan-African movement, the defining features of which includes the taking back of Africa, the restoration of Africa, restoring and building it into an unconquerable superpower for state, which is collectively governed by Africans both on the continent as well as in the diaspora. And with such a super-state having the power and the capacity to unite African people globally in protection and defense of our group, meaning collective as well as self-determined geopolitical interests worldwide. So a lot of Pan-Africanist organising has been with that focus in mind. And one of the reparations formations that I'm part of, which is a coalition called PARCO, Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, has been developing a particular approach. So just like we've heard over the last few days, there have been different perspectives shared on different aspects of Pan-Africanism and also what it is that Pan-Africanism is supposed to solve. And I would say that in terms of what is often seen as the reparations movement, which some of us define as the International Social Movement for African Reparations, then there are also different views advanced and put forward as to what that is all about. So I shall elaborate on the reparations quintessence of Pan-Africanism, based on critical insights from the activism of various reparations organisations in the UK and the experiences of various activist formations in which I have also been involved and played a leading role for almost 2 decades. So in effect, my presentation is very selective. I do not purport to be giving a total and full history of the UK movement for African reparations, because there's still a lot to be uncovered. And of course there was a limitation in what I could cover in my own research. So in particular, I'm going to talk about some of the experiences and therefore knowledge that has been produced and gained as a result of me being involved in activist formations such as PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, also the working with initially the African United Action Front, the Black United Front, which is no longer in existence, the International African People's Parliament, the Global African People's Parliament, as well as the African Emancipation Day Reparations March Committee, and also its partner campaign, the Stop the Maangamizi, which is a key Swahili word for African Holocaust, We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign. So all these formations are recent formations, okay, in terms of the history of reparations organizing that have Pan-African dimensions to them. I'm sure perhaps many of you would not have heard of any of them. And so this is the whole thing about knowledge and what knowledge is being produced, who's writing, what gets included in books, what are researchers studying. And one thing we do know is that there is a lack of research on the contributions that have been made by grassroots groupings that I believe have actually produced some of the most enlightened approaches to organising, not only around Pan-Africanism, but the attainment of holistic reparatory justice. So, in definitions, of course, despite its ancient historicity, there is a common perception and scholarship abounds regarding the notion that Pan-Africanism was formulated in response to European domination and, we could argue, conquest, and in particular that it evolved in the 19th and 20th centuries. And therefore it's deemed to have emerged as a distinct political movement, I would say, in the 20th century. And it is commonly understood that Pan-Africanism has been largely something that has been shaped by Africans in the diaspora, working with some Africans on the continent. But we know, and myself now being a student of history, history and the writing and recording of history is a process of power. Also, there's big politics in the writing of histories of Africa. And one of the things that we know is that oftentimes in our quest for Black liberation and even Pan-Africanism studies, a lot of the sources and the texts that we're reading have not necessarily been written or produced by Africans on the continent. And not just those that lived there and stayed there, but also those from the continent that are also living here in Europe. So I wish to question some of the assumptions inherent in some of these dominant approaches to defining Pan-Africanism, whereby Pan-African organising is deemed to have started in the diaspora with the likes of people like David Walker, Martin Delaney, the Right Honourable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, also Amy Ashwood Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Henry Sylvester Williams, George Padmore, Queen Mother Moore, and the list goes on. It can no longer continue to be convincingly argued, taking into account present-day imperatives for cognitive justice and recognition of the plurality of knowledges, and that Africans from the continent are also knowledge producers too, but it's only when Africans started being forcibly trafficked en masse and enslaved as chattel from the 15th century onwards, in particular in terms of the modern phase, into the diaspora, that is when we began to organise in defence of our own social and political emancipation. As many of the scholar activists in PARCO argue, the countless abortive and sometimes successful aggression by foreign powers against Africa compelled responses from visionary African spiritual, political, military leaders to unify our communities on the continent of Africa. Okay? So supporting historical evidence of this is also provided by many of our scholars, such as Sheikh Anta Diop, Chancellor Williams, Walter Rodney, John Henry Clark, Amos Wilson, Molena Karenga, Marimba Ani, Ife Amadune, Mushere Mugo, and the list goes on, Jacob Carovers and many more, especially those scholars who are members of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. So such responses to foreign aggression against Africa have included the use of armed struggle in order to unify our communities into greater, stronger, and therefore more impregnable polities, with such polities being capable of independently defending our sovereignty, safeguarding our geopolitical and cultural interests, not only locally and nationally, but also internationally, and therefore maximising our own determined developmental potentialities in the world. The aforementioned is the rationale not only for conceptualizations in ancient times of unique African value systems such as Ma'at and Ubuntu, but also for building of historically magnificent polities, such as in ancient times the unified Kemet, Nubia, Dahomey, Ethiopia, Congo, Zimbabwe, and KwaZulu. Thus far, histories of Pan-Africanism have tended to privilege the definitions and movements of Pan-Africanism outside of Africa, as I've stated. So through action research that I've been involved in, I've also been exposed to other notions of Pan-Africanism which have been shaped by Africans who come directly from the continent of Africa and who have also been organising here in the UK. So there's a definition that I'd like to share with you that comes from one of my colleagues, Brother Kofi Mawuli-Klu, who many of you will know, who's also a co-founder of PARCO. And he argues that Pan-Africanism is an anti-imperialist, decolonizational movement rallying together a broad array of all African-loving forces that are interested in linked networking globally, so combining the global and the local, in pursuit of various configurations of an independent, worldwide, political, ideological, cultural and organizational framework of struggle for the total liberation, unification and self-determined progression of Africans and our kith and kin.
Big definition, big definition.
One of the reasons why we in PARCO in particular argue that this is a useful explanation is because it is a more inclusive definition of Pan-Africanism, which recognises the various ideological and political, cultural and spiritual tendencies within the Pan-African movement. Very often, when we refer to Pan-Africanism, we often refer to a particular ideology. And, you know, some would ascribe, for instance, we've had it on several of the slides, the definition advanced by Kwame Ture of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, such as Pan-Africanism being the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. And there are other definitions. But all these definitions, and of course there are some which are better than others, do not clearly reflect the fact that within Pan-Africanism there are a diversity of particular political, ideological, organisational, strategic and tactical tendencies of conducting the struggle for African unity. So moving on now to make that link between Pan-Africanism and reparations, which many people, and I think certainly in popular conceptualizations, just reduce to financial compensation, which is a very important aspect of reparations. And a lot of the time when we when we engage in discourse about reparations, it's very passive. It's really about someone giving back to us, okay? It's we are waiting to get our reparations from somebody who's got the power to give it back to us. So reparations as a concept is an ancient concept, and it's one of the most misunderstood terms within popular understandings of reparations, of course, limiting it and defining it as just being about financial repayments or compensation. The etymology of the term reparations originates from the Latin repare, of which there are a variety of meanings associated with the term. One such meaning being the modern English term repair, meaning to restore to good condition, to set right, or to make amends. African-American law professor Carlton Waterhouse points out that the concept of making amends is only one of the two original meanings of repair, I say reparations, in the English dictionary, in particular the Collins English Dictionary. And that one of the other meanings of repair is to restore or renew. So Waterhouse therefore concludes that reparations are best understood as efforts to repair past damages or injustices. However, he also asserts that the broader meaning of repair relates to the transformation of the thing or the group or the people who have been harmed or damaged, best to be understood as meaning their or our restoration and renewal. In a paper presented at the Birmingham Reparations Conference, organised by the then African Reparations Movement in December 1993, Dr. Kamani Nahusi, who was a member of the African United Action Front and many other organisations, ALICE, and many other organisations, asserted in a paper that he presented on the meaning of reparations that understanding the term reparations demands that this notion be applied to the specific historical experience and the related contemporary condition of Africans, illustrating that the meaning of the term reparations transcends repayment for past and continuing wrongs to embrace self-rehabilitation through education, organisation, and mobilisation. So this understanding of reparations is particularly epitomised in the activism of women such as Amy Ashwood Garvey, Pan-Africanist women, Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, Claudia Jones, Constance Cummins-John, Una Mason, who also did reparatory justice organising work in furtherance of the regeneration and reunification of African heritage communities within and beyond Britain. And this work was a contribution towards galvanising anti-colonial resistance against the imposition of Euro-American imperialism. So in the research that I'm doing, I actually re-chart what we know about the histories of Pan-Africanism and show that this was reparations organising too. So it's a reconceptualisation of what we see as perhaps two distinct but interconnected movements. Now, hence why it is important to recognise that throughout the generations, activists in the UK have been organising to effect and secure holistic reparatory justice as part of the continued struggle for African liberation. Now, by this, I mean that such activists and their corresponding organisational formations have, in the course of advocating and participating in the national and social liberation struggles of African people, both at home and abroad, on the continent and in the diaspora, have sought to promote the kind of fundamental radical change that will repair African people and our communities, doing so in ways and means that will bring about our global unification, development and prosperity in a new order of society that will also compel the entire world to respect our hard-won freedom, our hard-won justice and self-determination in all spheres of people activity. Therefore, embracing the conceptual definition of reparations advanced by Professor Chimwezu at the 1993 First Pan-African Conference on Reparations for Slavery, Colonization and Neo-Colonization, which was held in Abuja, Nigeria. In his paper, Reparations and a New Global Order, Professor Chimwezu defined reparations in this way. Reparations are mostly about making repairs, self-made repairs on ourselves, mental repairs, psychological repairs, cultural repairs, organizational repairs, social repairs, institutional repairs, technological repairs, economic repairs, political repairs, educational repairs, repairs of every type that we need in order to recreate sustainable black societies. Similarly, under international law, reparations must, as far as possible, wipe out all of the consequences of the illegal acts and re-establish the situation which in all probability would have existed but for. And in our case, we're talking about but for the Ma'angamizi, some people refer to the Ma'afa, but for chattel enslavement, colonialism, neo-colonialism, genocide, terrorism, racism, Afrophobia, the whole list goes on. Okay. In 2005, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the basic principles and guidelines on a right to a remedy and reparation for victims of violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. Now, this wasn't the UN just getting up and writing some nice declaration. These principles, which have been developed over centuries, were codified in 2005 in one document or framework, okay? So these principles have evolved as a result of people's struggles, not just our struggles, but indigenous peoples, Aboriginal peoples, and other peoples who have experienced colonization, dispossession, and so forth. Now, under international law, holistic and comprehensive reparations include measures of restitution, rehabilitation, compensation, satisfaction, and a cessation of the violations, so an end to the Ma'angamizi as it's currently impacting on us today, that's the African holocaust, and bringing about guarantees of non-repetition. Now, in the African struggle for reparatory justice, there's a lot of focus on compensation, but there's not enough focus on guarantees of non-repetition. And I've heard it referred to several times in this gathering, the Jewish situation. And that is often used as the template. Well, the Jews got theirs and Native Americans got theirs, meaning money, compensation, and Aboriginal people, and we're the only ones who haven't been. But lest we forget, the first act of repair in the Jewish struggle was establishment of the nation-state of Israel. Israel. It was re-establishing a Jewish homeland. And all the money that's come afterwards has been bolstering that homeland and the global might of Ashkenazi Jewish people who control Israel. So we are very misinformed about other people's reparation struggles and what they prioritized. So for Jewish people, it was nationhood, because that is what they argue they've been dispossessed of. Now for African people, and we're not copying Jewish people, because remember, we're mothers and fathers of human civilization, right? So our struggle for reparatory justice is an intergenerational struggle. And it has also been a struggle for restoration of nationhood and peoplehood and unification, hence Pan-Africanism. So we cannot separate the two. And unfortunately, there's become a disconnect that is very problematic and is actually untrue. Because reparations organising began the day that we were first kidnapped on the shores of Africa. And even when we jumped overboard those ships, it was because we wanted to return home. And so that resistance that took place in the Middle Passage was part of us trying to reassert and restitute our freedom, our communities, our right to our homeland and to belong to our peoplehood and to develop that. So
the Jewish homeland question was on a wider agenda, really.
So I will continue, and I'm sure there'll be a lot to say after I finish. So in the paper that I deliver next, I go on, and I don't have the time to do it, and I apologize, and I've said this is a very selective presentation, okay? But in my paper, I go on to earmark some landmarks in the Pan-African struggle for reparations, which we in PARCO refer to Pan-African Reparations for Global Justice, by seeking to elaborate on some of the influences which have shaped Pan-African organising as part of the long road to the attainment of efforts to effect and secure holistic reparatory justice that we have been engaged in as Pan-Africanists, as Pan-African reparationists here in the UK. And I begin in the 1700s. You see, a lot of scholarship is out there about the movement in North America. And most of the scholarship that we are reading on reparations is very US-based. But the history of reparations organising also goes back in the UK to the mid-1700s. And one of the early landmarks is around 1797, where I trace the commencement of the UK contingent of the International Social Movement for African Reparations, with the formation of organisations that you will have heard of in other contexts, such as the Sons of Africa, who are an 18th century political group led by African abolitionists who campaigned and organised for an end to chattel enslavement, restitution of our freedom and our sovereignty. If you look back to what they were arguing at that time, these were our thinkers, they were organisers, they were strategists. And we have to also not further marginalise their voices by trying to limit what they and others stood for in terms of our current conceptualizations and overstandings. So it included people such as Kwabena Otobo-Kugwano, Oluda Equiano, and other leading members of the UK's African heritage communities. Now, Otobo-Kugwano was enslaved in the Fante village in present-day Ghana, and he used his newly acquired freedom from enslavement to write and publish, with the help of his associate, Oluda Equiano, the political treatise, Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of the Slavery and Commerce of the Human Species. Now, in this text, Kugwano raised the issue of adequate reparation and restitution, that's the word that he used, for the injuries that Africans experienced as a result of the Maangamizi, or the African Holocaust. Then I go through all the way up to now, and I've only got a few minutes left, so I want to, in the last few minutes that I have, focus just on some of the organising that I think is most relevant, because a lot of questions have come up about where are we going, what is the direction, and I've also heard it said, well, we don't really have any templates in terms of this Pan-African nation or this reunification. And actually that's not true.
Very true.
We have a lot of templates, and each generation has added to that. So in this current phase and dimension of reparations organising, many of us who see ourselves also as Pan-Africanists are literally building on those freedom visions of our ancestors that live on in us today. And in particular, I just want to highlight some of the efforts of a formation that I'm part of through the Global African People's Parliament that has been championing an approach to reparatory justice in association with its constituent member organisations that looks at reparations or reparatory justice in terms of nation building. So in notions of reparations, there are two main strands, ideologically and politically, okay? There's been the kind of African or black nationalist approaches. So the Back to Africa movements, Garveyism, Rastafari, etc., etc. And then there's been what some of us refer to as the integrationist kind of civil rights dimensions, that looks at us kind of just carving out space and getting more, if you like, civil or even recognition of human rights in the countries in the diaspora. But the reality is, our lives will not matter until Africa becomes central in all of our organising. We cannot, as Africans in diaspora, think that we're going to solve our issues when our continent is being recolonised today. So that is why the dominant, what have been, if you like, some of the marginalised perspectives in those who are researching and writing about Pan-Africanism and reparations, we need to make some of the nationalist perspectives more central.
Yes, yes.
Because these are the ones that have always been leading our people.
Yes.
Taking the vision of our ancestors, but not just, and it's been said, we can't go back to the past, but that's not what we're talking about.
No,
we're talking about furthering that African unity project for our generation. And so in GAP, we have a notion that is not ours. It's just we've just put some wording together, but the idea is from all the generations that have gone before, in terms of a decolonial approach to African nation building, that is not based on these Westphalian model states, and that set the Berlin 1884-1885 consensus. Those borders that separate ethnicity from ethnicity, nationality, and linguistic cultural communities from each other, and are linked to many of the conflicts and fratricidal conflicts that we have in Africa today. So we need another model of nation building, and we promote something called Ma'at Ubuntu Man, and that is basically a state that is based on the African conceptualization ideals of Ma'at and Ubuntu. So it is African governance that takes some of the best of our African thinking from creation that we have shaped and carried with us and evolved culturally, to look at how do we reconstruct Africa, not only for Africans on the continent, but for those of us who are her children, who are alienated and separated. Ma'at Ubuntu Man. And that is two component parts, my last 2 minutes. That Ma'at Ubuntu Man is based on the notion that in the diaspora, we are African heritage communities for national self-determination. We're not minorities. We're not BAME nothing. We are an oppressed nation in the diaspora. And our nation, our homeland is Africa. Whether we choose to live there, whether we choose to rematriate or repatriate, we have to be tightly connected to Africa, as the Jew is to Israel. And that's what gives them power all over the world. But many of us are organizing, think that just being black is enough. And it becomes an oppositional struggle of blackness and whiteness. We need to move to Africanness, a rediscovery of our African personality, and the world and everything that comes with that. So these are African heritage communities for national self-determination, which are Ma'at Ubuntu Jamas. So they're kind of communities where we are unified across our differences, but we link organically with Africans on the continent who are also going through similar processes around resistance to these states, which are impositions and are a manifestation of the Ma'angamizi, and those are the Sankofa Homes. So the new Africa will be a combined effort of the Ma'at Ubuntu Jamas and the Sankofa Homes. And therefore, in our process of organizing ourselves, we will have the power to shape our world and to take back everything that has been taken from us. Thank you.
always, a fantastic presentation. I want to ask in relation to the issue of Israel as an example, and the state of Israel as an example of reparations, and whether that creates political contradictions if we recognize Israel as reparations in respect to the fact that the establishment of the state of Israel effectively created a reparations issue for the people that live there, and how we navigate that. Yeah? So that one.
Okay, thank you. Okay, is there other questions?
Yeah, let's take 3 questions right now.
Yeah. Yes.
Lord, me Africa. That run with the mic now, you know?
Okay.
Which one, sir?
In the blue shirt. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I've always thought about reparations as asking for money.
Yeah.
So it's you've convinced me to become a reparationist today. Because I've always been against reparation. You can't ask the white man to give you something for free. You have to pick up the gun and do something. So taking it from the holistic angle, you've really convinced me today. It's just a comment.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, thanks.
Any more questions? Quick, short, first.
Yeah, give thanks. Give thanks for the presentation. My question is this. You mentioned a number of organizations, GAP and whatever the initials were. In what way are they connected to grassroots people? Yeah, that's my question. In what way are they connected to the grassroots people? And also, in Chinwezu's definitions, where are those organizations in the UK? Thank you.
All right, so we've had 2. Is there a third one? Okay, Dr. Cecil. Okay, all right. Well, I'll just make a start then. So, thank you for the question, Brother Tafazwa.
Any more question? No?
Oh, okay.
No, let's finish that.
Okay, so thank you for that. That was important for me to be able to clarify. No, I'm not saying that Israel is a model that we should follow. That is not reparatory justice. And in fact, I did kind of use the terms reparations and reparatory justice intermittently, but actually there is a distinction. Because in some struggles for reparations, they are developed that also causes, as Brother Tafazwa has said, other issues or oppression for other groups. Now that cannot be our way. If we're talking about Ma'at and Ubuntu, we have to go to the African way and try and provide some leadership and stewardship again of our earth and our planet according to our way of life that the Ma'angamizi has cut us largely away from. Because even though there's the continent, we know on the continent our people are still struggling for that liberation, and it's not just economic liberation. So it does present contradictions, because we cannot get or effect or secure or even take reparations that involves trampling on other people. So that is why I spoke about, and I did say my presentation was very selective and very specific. I spoke about work that I'm involved in, because that's what I know best. And PARCO, the coalition that I'm part of, we talk about Pan-African reparations for global justice. Now this is a civilizational mission and a civilizational question. And a lot of the time, part of the damage, and I understand it, when you have been trampled on, part of your natural defense and way to resist is to say, okay, I'm going to displace you, and if anything, do unto you what has been done to us. But that is not the way forward. We need to set, a new standard. Not a new standard. We need to actually evolve and shape for our times the best of what our ancestors have bequeathed to us and that our people are living with today. Now, on the second question, in relation to some of the structures that I'm involved in. All of the structures that I'm involved in do not purport to represent every African in this country or globally. There are many different structures and Pan-African organisations that I personally am not part of, that are doing work. There are many Rasta organisations, there are many Pan-Africanist groupings. We're here in Birmingham. Cannot not mention the Pan-African Congress movement.
Yes, yeah.
There's Brother Tafadzwa who represents the Al-Kebulan revivalist movement. We're here representing many different movements, but I don't claim to speak for all these different groups who have to speak for themselves. So in terms of PARCO and GAP, which I can speak to the African Emancipation Day Reparations March Committee, where thousands of people come out every year to march on the 1st of Mosiah or August. And many of them are not part of organisations. They're ordinary people who have a right to reparations, and they march in defence of their own rights, their own family rights, human rights, people's rights, and the rights of our Mother Earth. So there are many different participatory processes that people can engage with. Many people choose not to, but that is their choice. Now, in terms of all the structures that I'm part of, they have international dimensions. So PARCO in particular works very well in West Africa, on the continent of Africa, with indigenous African communities around the struggles for reparatory justice. Because what happens in the UK is that even in what's called the Pan-African circles or the black kind of radical circles or whatever, we're small compared to our people in the UK in terms of demographics.
Very true.
We're very small. We're not influencing even our wider community here in the UK. So the fact of the matter is we have to go beyond even these existing groupings and recognise the different structures that are out there. So I'm very proud to say that we are working in a truly Pan-African way with thousands of Africans on the continent linking into communities, not nation states, not African heads of government, not building kind of satellite communities, but working with indigenous African communities and polities on the ground, one of which is represented here today, who you'll be hearing from, Nana Kobina Nketsia V, and he will say a lot more than what I can. That's all I think I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. Come on, let's do it better.